Good evening, everybody. The fourth meeting of the 25th Council will now come to order. All of our councilors are present via Zoom, and we'll get started with a moment of silence and Pledge of Allegiance in English, and I'll ask Councilor Grout to do that, and then if Councilor Pena would be so kind, we'll have her do it in Spanish. Can you do the honors, Councilor Grout?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Councilor Pena?
Thank you, Mr. President. Juro fidelidad a la bandera de los Estados Unidos de América y la república que representa una nación bajo Dios, indivisible, con libertad y justicia para todos.
All right. Thank you, councilors. As was noted in a press release from our office on Friday, posted on our website and noted in our published council agenda, this meeting has special procedures and is being held via Zoom video conference. Members of the public, city staff, and media have the ability to view this meeting live through 4 different platforms: GovTV on Comcast Channel 16, the GovTV website, YouTube, and Zoom webinar. These live streams can be accessed from most smartphones, tablets, or computers. Also, this meeting is closed caption, and you may be enabled to close captioning services on your television or device at this time. For those watching on the live stream, thank you for joining us. The video recording of this and all past council meetings will remain available for viewing at any time on the City Council's website. Council staff is available via telephone if members of the public need assistance finding the videos online. Please call 505-768-3100 for assistance during business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Council is accepting live public comments as well as any written comments. Written comments received by 3 p.m. were distributed to the councilors in advance of tonight's meeting. We have no proclamations or presentations tonight, but we do have an economic development discussion, and that's going to be a presentation from our friend Alaska Piper, the market director of the Railyards market. And so we will turn it over to Ms. Piper.
Wonderful. All righty. Thank you, President Benton and councilors, for having me tonight. I'm very excited to share some highlights of the Railyards Market Annual Report. My name is Alaska, and I've worked with the market since 2014. I know many of you councilors and in your different rooms out there have been influential and had an important role in nurturing and growing the market. But for those who are watching who don't know about the Grassroots Project, here is a slide with a little bit of information about our mission and history. The nonprofit project was founded in 2014 by a group of neighbors and community members that had a really fantastic dream to activate the historic Railyard space, which had been dormant for decades, and transform it into a hub for community. So we have grown a lot since that time with a lot of valuable neighborhood and stakeholder input. And in 2020, We graduated. We were formerly fiscally sponsored by the Barelas Community Coalition. We graduated to become our own nonprofit. We survived and were open during the pandemic. We offered a sort of drive-through pivot at the beginning of it all, and we're chugging right along into 2022 now. So I want to share some highlights from our annual report for 2021. Apologies. 2021 was really a phenomenal year for recovery and for growth. Like many businesses, we had some shakier times during the pandemic, uncertain times. But in 2021, over 130,000 people visited. That's both locals and tourists, the historic site, and supported 503 farm, food, and maker businesses. So the market operates on Sundays, May through October, and one weekend in December. And amongst all those days, the vendors generated $2.8 million in gross receipt sales. To put that into perspective, that's almost maybe a little bit more than 2 times what we normally do. We normally gross around 1 million for vendors pre-pandemic. So 2021 was a good recovery year. There were a lot of sales of food nutrition services as well, like SNAP, WIC, Double Up Food Bucks. The Railyards market sprouts a lot of successful businesses. Many graduate and have open storefronts in your districts and on your main streets. So we're really excited to see our vendors thriving. Affordability and accessibility are paramount to us as well. We work really hard to make sure that the products at the market are accessible to all the communities in New Mexico, and that the vendor fees are affordable. So I always like to put that we haven't changed our growers fee, I think, since 2014. We actually brought the fee down then. But our growers booth fee is still only $5 a day. So we really work hard to make the market accessible for these businesses so that they can thrive. A significant portion of our annual attendance and sales can be attributed to the holiday market, which occurs in December for one weekend. And this year was one of the most successful events ever. It was really smooth, streamlined. 22,000 people or more came through over one weekend and supported 175 vendors. A lot of sales and just impact. It was an amazing event. We worked really closely with the city to reduce traffic to the historic neighborhoods around the Railyards. And we worked really closely, and want to thank the Department of Arts and Culture. They helped coordinate a park and ride service from the zoo. So this past year, despite being in a pandemic, has been one of our most successful years ever. And we're really happy to see these metrics and see that there's a huge demand for local food and local services that we provide. And we think that that shows that there's a huge need for more events at the Railyards that do these kind of things and expand this nonprofit community treasure. So we've come a long way with a lot of neighborhood and stakeholder support, but today I'm really here just to thank the city. We couldn't do what we do without you. This project is just a shining example of the truly amazing things that can happen when community and city come together. I wanted to extend a really sincere gratitude to this council. Councilor Benton has been incredibly visionary and helpful in moving this project forward and activating the Railyards. The mayor's office has been wonderful to work with, and we've worked very closely with Arts and Culture and Director Sanchez this past year. So we just couldn't make this community event happen without your support.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, please finish
I
up.
wanted to put a couple more love notes up there.
Okay.
We work with so many different city
Absolutely.
departments out there, and just wanted to thank everyone. I'm open for questions. I love talking about the market, and I've included some additional slides and contact info and some metrics and demographic info in your printed packet today.
Thank you, Alaska. I'll open up to counselors and see if we have any counselors with specific questions or comments for Alaska. I see Counselor Davis hand up.
Alaska, it's so good to see you again. Thank you. This is one of my favorite presentations every year, mainly because it's one of our favorite things to do, right, in my family. But I want to say there are a couple of businesses that I work with in my other life. They got their start at the Railyards market that have expanded to hire local folks doing marketing, renting buildings, going from pop-ups to brick and mortars to online. It's just been fabulous, and it's exactly what we should be doing in the city to help each other. It's also, near as I know, one of our biggest events, regular events of the city that we all look forward to. And I think the holiday market is always one of our big pieces, and it spun off several other markets for people that you don't have enough room for. So congrats to that. I'm glad to see the city's doing this. And I want to say thanks to Councilor Benton, who really has been pushing this and pushing us to invest more in the Railyards so we have more space and more opportunity for this. So thanks to all you're doing. We appreciate it.
Anyone else? I'll just quickly say also a thank you to Alaska and everyone in the coalition, everyone who's worked so hard over the years on the market. And, you know, the market was the first place where average citizens got to really come down and check out the Railyards and not only just have some fun and shop and get some good products and fresh food and all the things that are sold at the market, but you can get a peek into all those buildings. And so for everyone who's watching, the new season's coming on, it's just a great outing. It's a great family outing to go to the Railyards. And that's all a quick story about the Railyards. You know, we bought this very early in my term, in my time in the council. The city did step forward and we purchased the property, and I being an architect, I am into some extremely unsexy stuff like getting roofs on the buildings so that they don't deteriorate any further. And so I cobbled together about $1 million to just get started on one of the roofs. And RJ Berry came in and said, "Well, Counselor, you know, we want to spend it just on this one building and just get that up and running." And I said, "Were you going to do the roof on that building?" He goes, No. We're just gonna patch it up and get it open." And so hats off to him for doing that, because the blacksmith shop was sort of the first step in making it a public place. And then, yeah, kudos to the Keller administration. They have really, wow, the investment and the completion of the roofs, really something that not many of us notice or see, but that protect these priceless industrial age treasures. There's just nothing like it. There are very few places like it in the United States, the Railyards in general. So hats off to them too for moving that forward so efficiently in the first year, and all the help we've had from the legislature on that as well in terms of funding it, and from my fellow city councilors supporting the growth and preservation of that site. So thank you, Alaska. The data is pretty impressive with the amount of economic development and as Councilor Davis said, the spinoff into brick and mortar businesses around town. So thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the market this year. So we'll move on to general public comments. And Julian, do we have folks signed up? Hello to those of us joining to provide live general public comment. We also received written comments that were distributed to the counselors in advance of tonight's meeting. Members of the public will be able to address the council if they've signed up for live public comment per the instructions published on the agenda and on our website on Fridays before the meeting. Speakers will be moved into the meeting room 2 at a time. They will remain muted with their camera off until they're called upon to speak, at which point they can turn on their camera, unmute themselves, and will have 2 minutes to provide comments to the council. After that, they will again be muted and return to be an attendee of the Zoom webinar. So here are the public comment ground rules. You have 2 minutes to present. Comments are to be addressed to the counselors only through the council president, and any disruptive conduct will result in removal from the Zoom webinar. So Mr. Moya, please call the name of the first speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. The individual that signed up for general public comments has not joined the meeting. So that'll conclude general public comment, but we do have a couple other individuals that signed up for individual items later in the meeting.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll go to administration question and answer period now. Counselors, any questions for the administration? I see Counselor Grout, followed by Counselor Bassan.
Mr. President, my question is for Chief Medina. I wanted to ask, what is the process citizens should follow to report a property crime when the citizen is not the victim of the crime? And then I have 2 follow-up questions.
Hello, I'm Interim Commander Roger Legendry, Mr. President and Councilor Grout. I am going to answer that question for Chief Medina. What is the process citizens should follow to report a property crime when the citizen is not the victim of the crime? What we actually do as far as a report, you need to be the victim of a crime in order to file the actual report. But what can a citizen do if they're not the victim but witness a property crime? The first thing to do would be to call 242 cops. That's 242-2677. And that is the non-emergency line for the Albuquerque Police Department. At that time, an officer will be dispatched and they can investigate whatever possible crime has been committed. So for instance, if it was an auto burglary or something of that nature, or appears to be an auto burglary, the officer can actually go out and try to identify a victim, at which point a report could possibly be filed once that victim is identified and if they wish to file the report. The best thing that somebody can do if they witness a crime where they are not the victim is not only to call 242 cops, but to provide their information and what they saw. Give good details as far as clothing descriptions or anything like that of any offenders that they may have seen, or if there's any potential video evidence that they may be aware of, such as cameras on houses or anything of that nature. Most times an officer is going to be dispatched on the crimes. They're going to come out in order to investigate, because if those crimes are occurring, we're definitely going to want to start tracking down those victims sooner than later, so we can get those reports and we do have that accurate data.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up, will 242 cops take these non-emergency calls and file a report also?
So 242 cops is a non-emergency line. They're gonna be the ones that will take the call for service and dispatch officers as need be to the area. If it's not a call for service will be entered. But in the case that a victim does call to file a report, we have what's called a telephone report unit that will actually take reports for a variety of different types of calls. And those calls would include anything from fraud, residential burglaries, auto vandalism, lost property, telephone harassment, theft or larceny, vandalism. Those are the sort of reports that the citizens of Albuquerque can actually call the telephone report unit on and report, where they don't have to wait for an officer and they can do it at their own convenience. And that phone number is 768-2030.
Okay. And then has the crime reporting process changed in the last year? And if so, why?
So the crime reporting process has changed slightly. The telephone report unit has started taking significantly more types of reports to include property crimes with general offender information and lost and stolen ID cards. There's also been an increase in the number of reports that could be filed online, as I was discussing before. The purpose of that change is in order to alleviate the strain to the field officers, where they're going to be able to respond to priority type calls much easier. And that also creates more of a convenience for the person who's wanting to file a report. So whereas they may not have to wait for an officer, they can file that report at their own convenience, and where they call telephone report unit and whatnot.
Okay. All righty. Well, thank you. That's all I have tonight.
Thank you, Councilor Grau. Councilor Bassan, you still have a question?
No, Mr. President, thank you.
All right. Councilor Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is also a question for APD. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it happened today. I was outside my office today and I was speaking on the phone and I watched a fight in progress. I watched several subjects. There's two groups of drug dealers that are near the area of my business. And they were heaving rocks back and forth over Central Avenue from the south side to the north side. At 2:18 p.m., I dialed 911 because I was worried that there was going to be someone hit by a rock or a vehicle hit by a rock. And I was immediately put on hold for a while. And when I hung up to recall back, shortly thereafter, somebody called me back. I ended up getting a call back. And at that point, I was told that my call would be taken care of. And then I was put on hold a second time. And then at that point, no one answered. It just stayed on hold for a while until I disconnected the line. And at that point, we're probably about 5 or 6 minutes down. The subjects actually walked away and would have liked to have contact with the police, but no one else ever called me back in reference to that 911 call. When I was a police officer, you always followed up on a 911 call. And this time, no one followed up with me.
At this time, I don't have the answer to that, Councilor Sanchez, and that's something, the details would have to be looked into at this time regarding that incident.
Thank you. So if you can please give me a call, I'll give you all the details so you can investigate why I was not called back on a 911 follow-up.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Any other questions for the administration? Okay, well, seeing none, we'll move on to the journal. Vice President Lewis.
I move approval of the journal.
And is there a second? Second by Councilor Bassan. Ms. Hinojos to call the vote.
Councilor Bassan.
Yes.
Councilor Davis.
Yes.
Councilor Peeberkorn.
Yes.
Councilor Grau.
Yes.
Councilor Jones.
Yes.
Councilor Lewis.
Yes.
Councilor Pena.
Yes.
Councilor Sanchez.
Yes.
Councilor Benton.
Yes.
That passes unanimously.
Thank you, Ms. Hinojos. We'll move on to communications and introductions. Are there any changes to the letter of introduction? I have a couple here. I move that the rules be suspended for the purpose of introducing EC 34 and placing it on the March 7th council agenda for action. EC 34 is appointing Ethan Watson to the position of city clerk. And this will require 2/3 of the councilors to suspend the rules. Councilor Davis.
I'll offer a second, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you for that second. And councilors, I think I'll call at this point just to clarify to the public and to everyone watching that what the process is, and ask Mr. Melendres to speak to that and to the status of this and possibly other appointees.
Thank you, Mr. President and councilors. The motion that's before you is to allow the introduction of a reconfirmation bill of the Albuquerque City Clerk. The city charter includes several positions that are appointed with the advice and consent of the city council. One of those is the city clerk. The other is the city attorney. The administration has sent down the city clerk and the city attorney for consideration for the council for reconfirmation, given the mayor's reelection and having taken office for a second term on January 1st. So what you're voting on is to accept this communication into the council legislative process so that you may consider it on March 7th.
Thank you, Mr. Melendres. Any other questions regarding the process? Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Mr.
Followed by Councilor Davis. Sorry, Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Mr. President. So is this a result of the letter you had sent earlier? I think there was a letter that you had sent about confirmations or confirming people.
Yes. So on or about the first of the year, we did send a memo to the administration regarding these the various appointments as per the charter.
Okay, so these two confirmations satisfy your letter, or? Well,
in part, this satisfies the letter. And if there are questions about the others, Mr. Melendres can speak to that. But we did have a list as we, our council staff and advisors have expressed, is that there are a number of other appointees besides these two, but these are the two that have been sent down by the administration as of now. I think we're going to have continuing discussions, because I think we have a disagreement with the administration as to which of the others will be sent down. But I'll ask Mr. Melendres to just speak to that, of what's transpired since we sent that original memo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just clarification, because I wasn't really aware of what's going on. So I just wanted to make sure. So this is a result of the letter. These two are just two of several others that are still in question. And then I guess my question would be to Mr. Melendres. So what's the process exactly? Because I mean, it feels like I've been on council forever now. And I know that I don't recall us doing this before. So I guess my question would be, like, is this something just correcting a process that we haven't done in the past? And when was well, I guess, first of all, kind of explain the process. Then when was the last time we did this? Because I think we confirmed Sarita and the chief. And I just haven't had time to talk to Councilor Benton about this, but I was just wondering, is it part of the charter that we're supposed to reconfirm them? And when was the last time we confirmed a mayor's and administration's selections?
Mr. President, Councilor Pena, the city charter includes a section that includes the duties of the mayor. And one of those sections identifies positions that the mayor appoints with the advice and consent of the city council. There are 5 positions specifically referenced within that section, and some others that I'll reference as well. The ones that are specifically referenced include the CAO, the chief of police, and the fire chief. That section also references any deputy CAOs, and that appears to be within the discretion of the mayor and the administration as to the number and positions of any deputy CAOs that would be proposed. The other 2 positions that require confirmations are the ones that are being discussed as part of adding to the letter of introduction, the city attorney and the city clerk. The city council confirms these appointees at least once, and potentially more than once, depending on a few factors. The first is that when a mayor takes office, the city council is called upon by the charter to confirm the CAO at that time. Also to confirm other key appointees, including the fire chief, the police chief, the city attorney, and the city clerk. As we've seen with respect to the fire chief and the city police chief, there has been turnover in those positions since the time that the mayor first took office. So upon that instance of turnover, any subsequent appointees similarly have to be confirmed by the city council, and that has been done so far for both the current fire chief and the current chief of police. The charter speaks a little bit differently with respect to the positions of the city attorney and the city clerk. In 2009, the city charter was amended by the voters of Albuquerque. The city council prepared a question and the voters approved changing language within that section of the charter to essentially essentially state that those positions are coterminous with the term of the mayor. That gives a relatively clear indication that upon the re-election of a mayor, those positions need to be reconfirmed. The language in the charter with respect to those two positions is a little bit different than it is with respect to the CAO, the fire chief, and the chief of police. And I think that is to the point that Councilor Benton was referencing with respect to there's not broad consensus yet as to the obligations of the council to confirm those positions upon re-election, because the language in the charter is slightly different with respect to those positions as compared to the city attorney and the city clerk.
So, Mr. President, Mr. Melendez, so how would we determine that? Would we have to get some kind of determination whether they were or they were required to come down?
Mr. President, Councilor Pena, there was some wisdom and also some complexity associated with that wisdom with respect to what the voters and the city council approved in 2009. It was all sort of tied in. And as I referenced earlier, the charter was amended in 2009 to help clarify what the confirmation obligations of the city council were. Before that time, there was some ambiguity as to whether or not it even extended down to department heads of the various departments. And at that time, the city council also put forth a proposition to the voters that proposed to establish what is titled the city's Intragovernmental Conference Committee. And the purpose of that committee is identified by the charter, and its duties are spelled out a little bit more by ordinance, is to help evaluate these types of questions in the event that there is not consensus as to what the obligations are relative to the divisions of government within the city and their obligations under the charter. So the charter actually sets out a process, a bona fide process in the event of a disagreement. I think that the charter anticipates that, given the complexity of the city and the limits of the language within the charter, it's only natural that from time to time there may be some disagreement about what the obligations are. And so that committee is contemplated within the charter and in city ordinance. And to the extent that this question needs resolution, that would likely be an appropriate place to send the question. In order to do that, that committee would need to be essentially constituted or reconstituted. The city council did make an appointment to that committee several years ago, but a new appointee would likely be necessary together with a submission of a question if that's the appropriate path forward for the council.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. President, one more question. So in the past administration, not the past term from this mayor, but in past administrations, have we followed this? Because I know there was some talk about Councilor Sanchez had actually asked for this to be done before and we decided not to do it. So is there, and I don't know if I was part of the I don't know if I was on council when Councilor Sanchez did that, but so past administrations, have they followed this? The charter in that fashion?
Mr. President, Councilor Pena, in 2015, I believe it was I think it's actually 2013, Mayor Barry was reelected to his second term as mayor, and the question of confirmation of appointees was sort of at the forefront for a period of time then as well. I can't speak for Councilor Sanchez, may he rest in peace, or for the sort of thought process of the council at that time, given that it was a significantly different composition. But as president, Councilor Sanchez did submit a letter to the mayor, not dissimilar to the one that was referenced earlier from that Councilor Benton was discussing. And it did request that the city attorney and the city clerk be sent down for confirmation. Mayor Barry at the time, I think it was reported, so I'm not, giving away anything inside, but it was reported even in the media. I think the Journal reported a story that the mayor was declining to send down those appointments. At the time, the city council did make its appointment to this intragovernmental conference committee. However, the mayor's office at the time did not reciprocate with an appointment. And so the intergovernmental conference committee process that was contemplated in the charter did not have an opportunity to play itself out. And after that sort of stop in the process, the confirmations did not continue. My recollection is that actually the then city attorney resigned at some point, I think retired. And it could have been less relevant for that reason. And a new city attorney was appointed. So the council had its opportunity to make that confirmation in one way or the other. That's a little bit of the context. I can't speak directly to why, that the demand by Councilor Sanchez was not followed through at that time.
Thank you, Mr. President and Mr. Melendez. I think that's the last of my questions. So we tried to do this before, it didn't happen. So this mayor is actually sent down 2 names to follow kind of what the charter says. There's still some ambiguity in terms of the rest of them, and it looks like the council president may be pursuing that ambiguity to get clarification on it. And then, I just want to say that, I support both of these names, and then the other names. And I just want to say for the mayor, I've always been, and I've never really said this on record, but I've always really been impressed with his administration and the fact that he's appointed like 90% people of color to serve on his administration, doing the community work, being part of council for so many years. I really haven't seen that level of people of color on an administration. So I just want to say kudos to that. And I'm very impressed with Ethan. I think he's probably one of the only ones who's not a person of color, but I still like you, Ethan. So but anyway, so thank you, Council President. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Councilor Pena, and Councilor Davis is next.
Thank you, Mr. President. Councilor Pena actually got us started on some of my questions. I wanted to understand a little bit out loud more the process about what happens next. I think there's no disagreement, thanks to the voters' wisdom, that those 2 positions that the mayor sent down require a special hearing, and I'm glad to see that the president's scheduling that, and I appreciate the administration. It's my interpretation, quite frankly, that the charter is still pretty clear. Whether previous councils have followed through all the way with doing that, or found some other resolution to accept the mayor's nominees sort of in some other way, I think it's clear to me that a new administration starts when a new mayor is elected and sworn in. That's why we have an inauguration and a swearing in. But I don't think this needs to be an adversarial process. I think an administration deserves to have the team the mayor deserves to have the team that he, in this case, and in every other case before, but maybe one day would change, that he wants to put forth. But I do think that's part of our job at the council, is to ensure that there's appropriate vetting of candidates who will take on those leadership roles and who will be held responsible. So I appreciate that. And Mr. President, you and I and some other councilors have been in conversations with folks in the administration about how to move forward in this. Is it your understanding, Mr. President, that, and it is mine to be clear, that the administration does not believe, or the administration believes the next appropriate step to resolve this question is the intergovernmental committee?
Yes, I think we've been respectful and professional about the discussion, but there is a difference of opinion as to what the charter says, and this is the method that's laid out in the charter for for addressing such disagreements between the council and the administration on, particularly on issues having to do with the charter. So I see Councilor Pasans has her hands up, but I quickly wanted to ask Mr. Melendres while I'm on my train of thought here before I lose it. I think my understanding of the charter is the language having to do with the CAO and deputy CAOs, if I'm not mistaken, was in the original writing of the charter. And then over the years, some of these other appointees have been approved by the voters, i.e. I could be wrong about this. Maybe the city clerk and the city attorney were also in the original charter. And it doesn't really matter because whatever we have today is what has been amended over the years, and it is the charter. But I think there is there's a difference in the language as it was drafted and approved in the original charter and in the subsequent amendments to the charter that were approved by the voters. With regard to, we've added some additional positions that require advice and consent of the council. Is that correct?
Mr. President, that is generally correct. Prior to 2009, the charter stated that the CAO, and I think it referenced key staff. It was relatively vague, which is what precipitated, I believe, the need for clarity in that language. Again, as I referenced earlier, it could have even suggested that perhaps positions such as, just to pick somebody, the parks director would have required confirmation. And maybe that wasn't sort of the best use of the council's time, given the grand scheme of things. And so it did contemplate the CAO, it contemplated key staff, it contemplated the city attorney. It was silent as to the city clerk. Subsequent to 2009, it now specifically references the CAO and deputies. In 2015, the fire chief and the police chief were added to that list, again, by a voter-approved charter amendment. Backing up just a little bit to the 2009 amendments, at that time, specific processes were laid out for both the city clerk and the city attorney. And that language indicates that those positions are appointed for a time that is coterminous with the term of the mayor, which is one of the key language differences, and some other clarity, but that was the first time that the city clerk was brought into that mix.
Thank you. Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to clarify, aren't we just voting to suspend the rules on the letter of introduction and not for full discussion on this item?
That's correct. So since I think there were questions raised having to do with the other appointees that are not part of this discussion. So maybe I let us go too far on that. But I think there was some interest in getting clarification from Mr. Melendres on it. Any other questions, councilors? If not, we do have a motion and a second to suspend the rules. This is for EC 34 for the city clerk appointment. And this would be for holdover to our meeting on the 7th. Ms. Hinajos.
Councilor Bassan.
Yes.
Councilor Davis.
Yes.
Councilor Feeblecourt.
Yes.
Councilor Grout.
Yes.
Councilor Jones.
Yes.
Councilor Lewis.
Yes.
Councilor Pena.
Yes.
Councilor Sanchez.
Yes.
Councilor Benton.
Yes.
That passes unanimously.
Thank you. And then the next is EC 35. This is, I move the rules to be suspended for the purpose of introducing EC 35 and placing it on the March 7th council agenda for action. EC 35 is appointing Esteban A. Aguilar Jr. to the position of city attorney. And I see a second from Councilor Grout. Thank you. Any discussion, councilors? And this again requires a 2/3 vote of the councilors present. Ms. Hinajos.
Councilor Bassan.
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pieblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
That passes unanimously.
Thank you. And go to Vice President Lewis.
And Mr. President, I move approval of the letter.
Thank you. There's a motion and there's a second from Counselor Bassan. Thank you. On the letter of introduction. Ms. Hinojos to call the vote.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pieblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
All right. Thank you. We'll now move to reports of committees. Counselor Davis, FGO.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the matter of EC 484 and 487, make a motion that they be approved. In the matter of EC 485 and 486, the committee vote recommended that they be approved. In the matter of R232, R3, and R7, that they do pass. In the matter of O2, O3, OR, and R2, that they be without recommendation. I make a motion to accept this committee report.
And is there a second? I believe I may have misheard, but I think you may have said be approved on EC 485 and 486. To be clarified, that was receipt be noted correctly.
That's correct. If I went through it too fast. Yeah, it's RBN. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks. And we have a motion and a second from Councilor Bassan to approve the accept committee reports. Ms. Hinojos.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pieblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you. Councilor Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Public Safety Committee met on Tuesday, February 15th, and reports out the following items. In the matter of 0-81, 0-82, and R1, that they do pass. In the matter of R-209, that it be without recommendation. In the matter of EC-18, that it be approved and acted on at the meeting at which it is reported. I make a motion to accept the committee reports.
Thank you. And you have a second from Councilor Grout. Ms. Hinojos.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pieblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout, Counselor Grout.
Yes.
Thank you. Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you. Councilor Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee met on Wednesday, February 16th, and reports out the following items. In the matter of O83 and O7, that they do pass as amended. In the matter of R6, that it be without recommendation as amended. I make a motion to accept the committee reports.
And I will second that. Councilor Bassan seconded that. So we call the vote.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pieblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you, Ms. Hinojos. We will now move to deferrals and withdrawals. Counselors, any deferrals or withdrawals at this time? I'll start with one. This is a deferral from approvals. The EC 14, which is the mayor's appointment of Mr. Mark Reynolds to the Information Services Committee. I move a deferral to May 16th. Second from Councilor Bassan, thank you. And Ms. Hinojos.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Feeblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you. Next is deferrals from final actions. We have one from Councilor Bassan and Pena, R190.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thanks, Councilor Pena. R190 is approving an intergovernmental agreement between the City of Albuquerque, the County of Bernalillo, and the Albuquerque Public School District Board of Education to reform the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Government Commission. I move deferral until March 7th.
Thank you. And I see a second from Councilor Davis. Thank you. And Ms. Hinojos to call the vote on the deferral.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Feeblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you. We'll move on to consent agenda. Are there any changes to the consent agenda? Councilors, you can, if there's an item that you want to pull, you may state so at this time, and we'll remove it from the agenda and deal with it as a action item. Seeing none. For the individuals on tonight's consent agenda who are being appointed to serve on a board or commission and who may be watching from home, thank you for your willingness to serve us and the city in these important positions, and citizens are so much part of that. And so thank you for your service. And I'll go to Vice President Lewis.
Mr. President, I move approval of the consent agenda.
And I see a second from Councilor Grout. Thank you. And Ms. Hinojos to call the vote.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Feeblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you. We have no public hearings tonight, so we'll move on to approvals. And this
Mr.
will start-
President,
Yes.
my apologies. May I,
Councilor Bassan.
there's announcements, Mr. President.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Thanks for
Okay.
catching me on that. Take my
Thank
foot off the
you.
accelerator pedal. All right, announcements from Councilor Bassan and anyone else who has one.
Thank you, Mr. President. There will be an Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Government Commission meeting tomorrow, February 24th at 5 p.m. via Zoom video conference.
Thank you. And now we will move on to approvals, starting with Councilors Pena and Bassan, OC1, appointments to the 2022 Redistricting Committee.
Go ahead, Councilor Bassan.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Thanks, Councilor Pena. OC1 is appointments to the 2022 Redistricting Committee. I move approval.
We have a second from Councilor Davis. Thank you. And looks like you have an amendment.
Yes, Mr. President. And I don't know if we're going to put that up or not, but I would like to move that amendment, and then I'll ask Ms. Morris if she can help us clarify the details.
Mr. President, councillors, I can explain that while Julian is working on the details of pulling that up. Unfortunately, after we had put together and submitted the OC for the letter of introduction, council staff realized that the District 7 alternate, as is proposed in the original bill, Ms. Mayan Baroudin, I apologize if I've not said her name quite right, is already serving on the Energy Council for the City of Albuquerque. The boards and commissions ordinance, unfortunately, only allows the public to serve on one board at a time. And so Ms. Baroudin chose to stay on the Energy Council. And so we needed to find a new alternate for District 7. And so this amendment proposes to replace the District 7 alternate with Heather, and I'm probably going to say this last name wrong too, Bergmans. This amendment has 3 actions associated with it to switch out each of the references to Ms. Baroudin and replace them with Ms. Bergmans.
Thank you. Councilor Feeblecorn.
Mr. President, I was just going to comment that this was just an error. We did not know that Ms. Baroudin was on another committee at the time. And so I just appreciate the opportunity to replace Mayani Baroudin with Heather Bergmans.
Thank you. And you want to move that, this would be amendment number 1. If you'd like to move that, Councilor.
Yes, sir. I move for Amendment 1 to OC 22-1.
And I see a second from Councilor Bassan. Thank you. So we're on floor amendment number 1. If there are no questions, we'll move to the vote.
Councilor Bassan,
Yes.
Councilor Davis,
Yes.
Councilor Feeblecorn,
Yes.
Councilor Grapp,
Yes.
Councilor Jones,
Yes.
Councilor Lewis,
Yes.
Councilor Pena,
Yes.
Councilor Sanchez,
Yes.
Councilor Bento.
Yes.
That passes unanimously.
Thank you. We'll now move to item C.
Mr. President.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. We need to get back to the bill. Councilor Bassan and Pena.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is pretty straightforward. I guess if you all have questions, I'll defer to Ms. Morris, but otherwise I urge your support. And I don't know if Councilor Pena has anything to add.
Same here, Mr. President. Urge your support.
Thank you. Ms. Hinojos on the bill as amended.
Councilor Bassan,
Yes.
Councilor Davis,
Yes.
Councilor Feeblecorn,
Yes.
Councilor Grapp,
Yes.
Councilor Jones,
Yes.
Councilor Lewis,
Yes.
Councilor Pena,
Yes.
Councilor Sanchez,
Yes.
Councilor Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
And I should conclude this by thanking everyone who's agreed to serve on this very important task, and the alternates. And as public may not know, that there's one per council district, but there's an alternate who typically the alternates attend all the meetings and are available in the event that the voting member is not available. So I will move to item C, which is EC 18. This is the City of Albuquerque Labor Management Relations Ordinance, multi-year collective bargaining agreement with the Albuquerque Police Officers Association. I move approval. And I see a second from Councilor Bassan. Thank you. And we do have an individual signed up to speak, but I think maybe I'd like to hear from the administration at this point on just on their introduction to this CBA and the process that they went through, and then we'll hear from our public comments. There's someone in the mayor's conference room who can speak to the agreement.
Mr. President, if you give us a second, I'll have our folks from our
employee relations come up and talk to you about how we went through this process.
Thank you.
Council President and City Councilors, Michael Doran, I'm the Labor Liaison for the City of Albuquerque. In regards to APOA, we did start the contract process in late 2019, October of 2019. In 2020, we did have to halt negotiations. We suspended negotiations due to COVID. We did pick that process back up at the beginning of 2021. We have finished the process, and we do have the contract, which was signed by all the parties.
All right, thanks. That's a brief chronology anyway of how this went. We'll move now to, we have an individual signed up to speak on this matter. Mr. Moya, please call their name.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have Mr. Paul Broom signed up to speak. Paul, your 2 minutes will begin once you start speaking.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Mr. President? All right,
Yes.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Broom. I've been a negotiator for the APOA, Police Officers Association, for approximately 12 years. This was the longest bargaining process that we have actually had here, and quite frankly, in my many years of negotiating, it's one of the longest negotiations processes that I've ever actually dealt with. But throughout the process, as difficult as it was, the process did work, and I have to say, on behalf of the APOA, that I wish to thank the administration for the work and the time that they put in, and also for the department, for Chief Medina for his work and moving this process toward a settlement. It was ratified by the employees, and it was ratified quite overwhelmingly by the employees. And we actually believe that we now have a fair contract for the city, as well as a fair contract for our officers. And I notice a general feeling of relief when I speak with the officers now about this process and about this contract. They feel much more actually recognized by the city as being supporters of what they're trying to get done in the field on a day-to-day basis. So we appreciate your support, and we respectfully request that you ratify this agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Broman. Thanks for all your work on this. Councilors, at this point, are there any questions or comments with regard to this multi-year collective bargaining agreement? Councilor Sanchez.
Thank you. Just wanted to say that it's good to know that the officers have a contract and that they can move forward with their agenda. I'd like to thank the administration and thank the officers for coming to an agreement and getting this multi-year contract taken care of. Also, I just wanted one of the biggest questions that comes up, and this could be a question for Mr. Broom, and the one that always comes up is, and I know that it's there, an evergreen clause, and I just want to make sure that that's in there as well.
Mr. President, Councilor Lewis, the evergreen clause actually is contained in the Public Employee Bargaining Act when it was passed, when it was amended 3 years ago. And then when the city adopted its own ordinance in compliance with the Public Employee Bargaining Act, they included that in there as well. So yes, the evergreen rights are still actually in that contract, in the negotiations process, I should say.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that we had that worked out, so that way the officers know what they're looking at as well. Council President and Paul Broom, thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Do you have any other comment, Mr. Broom? I see.
No, thank you. No, thank you. That's all right, sir.
Very good. And so, yeah, my understanding of the evergreen is that the state took the lead on that. We're confirming it in this agreement.
Correct.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments from counselors? All right. Seeing none, we'll move to a vote. Ms. Hinojos.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pivotal,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
and passes unanimously.
Thank you. We'll now move to final actions. And this is item A. This is sponsored by Councilors Bassan, myself, and Councilor Davis, 078. And Councilor Bassan, I think you need to do the honors on this.
Thank you, Mr. President. 078 is amending Chapter 9, Article 4, Part 1, ROA 1994, the Police Oversight Ordinance. I move it to pass.
And I see a second from Councilor Davis. Thank you. We do have an individual signed up to speak on this matter. Mr. Moya, please call their name.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have Andrew Lippman. Andrew, please feel free to turn on your video, unmute yourself, and your 2 minutes will begin once you start speaking.
Council President and councilors, thank you for your time. I appreciate your willingness to hear me about this. In 2013, I chaired the Police Oversight Task Force, which was instrumental in drafting the ordinance to create the Civilian Police Oversight Agency. I must say I've been quite disappointed that not much has changed since that was done. In fact, the following year in 2014, the Department of Justice came in here and did a lengthy investigation, and which also touched on Civilian Police Oversight Agency. From what I have observed in the process, and I'm currently a candidate for a position on the CPOA board, there's some disarray there. First of all, it has taken quite some time. I was first contacted a little over 2 months ago on December the 19th regarding a position on this board, and I still have not, that process has not been finalized. I've been through some interviews, but nothing further has happened with that. This morning, I spoke to interim chair Chantel Galloway and interim executive director Diane McDowell, sorry. And based on my conversations with them, they sort of confirmed this. And I also confirmed that half the board is unoccupied. So to get to the bottom line, I think that this process is long overdue for a thorough examination. And I don't think that the council, particularly with new councilors on board who don't know the history of this situation, be deferred until a permanent executive director is hired for the agency and a new board is seated. With that, I'll stop and answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lippman. Appreciate your offering yourself to serve. Since Mr. Lippman has offered to serve on the board, any questions for him? And then we'll if all right with the co-sponsors, I'd like to ask Ms. McDermott to speak as well, but we'll get to that. Any questions for Mr. Lippman? And Mr. Lippman, I would just say that yeah, you know, we're I won't speak for the other sponsors, but I do see Councilor Bassan's hand up, and you know, we've been aware of the the difficulty in our process of getting appointees through. But we're attempting to address that. There's been a lot of back and forth also with the DOJ and the sponsors on this as well. So, Councilor Bassan.
Mr. President, I don't have any questions for Mr. Littman. I would just like to move the floor sub before we hear from any
Okay.
others regarding questioning,
Great.
if that's possible.
Very good. And I see a second from Councilor Feeblecorn, I believe. Thank you. So we have a motion for the floor substitute for 078, which is in your iPads, and we'll need a vote on that substitution. So I'll move that. Councilor Bassan, move it.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was hoping to explain a few things about the floor sub based off of some of our discussions that we had earlier this morning and throughout all of today. For the rest of the council, we had provided, myself and my co-sponsors, we provided the floor sub as of Friday for review over the weekend. But then throughout the weekend, I had some conversations with Director McDermott regarding some additional concerns that came up via our floor sub. So we've made a few other additional changes for the sake of full disclosure and everything. I was hoping that we could do a short presentation on what has changed between the floor sub that we provided for the weekend and today's edition, which in all fairness is not that much, but I also want to make sure that if we are going to vote on this tonight, that you all have the chance to really have the differences pointed out directly and clearly for questioning if that's the case. But just to make sure everyone's aware, between the meetings that we all had at the study session of the board, multiple conversations that I have had with Director McDermott. I know that some or both of my co-sponsors have had conversations as well. We've been really trying hard to work to find that middle ground on really what we think is the best avenue to move forward with really cleaning up this ordinance since it has been so many years, while also making sure that we still provide the public and the police department with the due diligence that they deserve on both ends of the spectrum. So with that, I think Ms. Coulidon was going to help me and us with a presentation on the differences that we made from Friday to today.
Ms. Coulidon.
Thank you, Mr. President and Councilor Bassan. So today's floor substitute really does four big things. First, it adds to the budget section of the ordinance, the committing to continue to provide funding to the CPOA that will allow it to carry out its important duties. Second, it clarifies that the CPOA is to report data regarding the outcomes of its disciplinary recommendations that it makes to the Chief of Police as part of its quarterly oral reports to the council. The actual imposition of discipline is at the discretion of the Chief of Police, and so the chief's actions in that regard should be documented and reported to the council. Third, the floor sub adds a provision limiting eligibility for the board to individuals who have not been employed by APD law enforcement for at least 3 years prior to their appointment to the board. And this is in recognition that an extended cooling off or distancing period is important for individuals who have been employed by APD specifically. The existing requirement that individuals not be employed by any other law enforcement department for just 1 year would remain in place. And fourth, the floor substitute clarifies that the director's semi-annual reports are to contain information regarding board member training progress. And additionally, the floor sub contains just some further cleanup and consistency edits just to make sure that the language tracks throughout with regard to other changes contained in the bill.
Thank you, Ms. Coulidon. So really any substantive changes were just the four, I believe, that you listed. I could speak for the other sponsors. and they can speak for themselves, but also we know that, okay, we're doing some touch up on this over the weekend, but this effectively, this is the floor sub that was in the bill book. And if I could speak for them, if councilors feel like they need to delve into this further, that'd be fine. We do have a light agenda tonight. We have the ability to discuss it further, answer any questions you may have. But if so, I did want to ask Mr. Melendez, is this substitution of a slightly different floor sub an issue that requires special action of any kind?
Mr. President, the general rules within the City Council Rules of Procedure require that if the council is going to finally act on a bill that is substituted the same night that it is substituted, that a suspension of the rules is required. The rules contemplate that upon the substitution of a bill, the bill would be deferred to the next meeting, in theory, to give folks opportunity to digest it, perhaps in the public and elsewhere.
Thank you. Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Mr. President. So maybe somebody from the staff can explain the enforcement, the law enforcement provision, and then how would it impact our current board members or future board members?
Mr. President, Councilor Pena, I think Julia Couladon may be prepared to speak to that, and Chris Sylvan as well. So I think Julia turned her camera on, and so we can start with her. And if Chris Sylvan has anything to add, he's available as well.
Thank you, Ms. Couladon.
Thank you, Mr. President, Councilor Pena. So the change made to the law enforcement experience portion contained in the floor sub would just add an extra qualification for prospective members if those members had worked for APD within the last 3 years, they would be ineligible for service on this board. So it's just requiring an extra sort of distancing or buffer for individuals who have specifically worked for APD within the last 3 years. Regarding prospective members who have worked for a different law enforcement agency, that time period would remain 1 year.
So thank you, Mr. President, Ms. Couladon. So how would it impact our current board members or future board member? I guess I understand the future board member, but how would it impact our current board members? Because I know there's a couple of people, I think, if maybe there's more that have. So would that kick them off the board?
Mr. President, Councilor Pena, unfortunately, I'm not familiar enough with the status of some of the current board members that may fall under this amendment to be able to speak on that, but perhaps Chris Sylvan or Director Melendez might be able to jump in and answer that for you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Sylvan, yeah, thank you.
Councilor President Benton, Councilor Pena, no, it would not affect well, actually, it would slightly affect one of the board members, and I'd have to double check on that. We have a board member that did retire from APD not too long ago, and I can get back to you on that very shortly. But as far as future board members, we don't have someone who would be disqualified because of that provision.
Okay, Mr. President, Ms. Couladon or Mr. Sylvan, I would just like more information on that because it's a little alarming to me, because I think the two members that come off the top of my mind, maybe three, but the two of them that I know have law enforcement background are actually Black members. So they're people of color. And if it would impact, the limited amount of people of color that we have on this board, that's of some concern. So I think for me, before voting on this, I'd like that question answered.
All right. Councilor Pena will take that into consideration here with the council. Councilor Vice President Lewis is next, and then Councilor Bassan.
Mr. President, just to clarify on the reduction of the members, I just a question. So the committee sub reduces the board to 7 members,
Correct.
I believe. And I guess if you all can just explain that. Was that what Councilor Pena was referring to just a moment ago? She was
I'll
partly.
let her speak for herself, but I believe she was speaking as to the provision that has been changed slightly in that, and there's been a lot of discussion around this, by the way, but that's the provision that states that if a retiree from APD, there's got to be a 3-year buffer period before they can serve on this board. And if they're from another law enforcement agency, it would be a year. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Councilor Bassan. And
Yeah, I believe that's right. I think some of the concerns were related to. I mean, also could be related to the reduction of the board members, just in limiting the diversity of the board in that kind of way as well. So I don't know if the sponsors would like to speak to that as far as the reducing the members to 7, and again the concern there is just the diversity on the board, as well as just representation from making sure we're covering parts of the city.
that may be a question for staff or from Councilor Bassan. She does have her hand up. Would you want to address that question from Councilor Lewis, Councilor Bassan?
Sure, Mr. President, I will, if Councilor Lewis will repeat it, because I was working on trying to confirm part of the other question that Councilor Pena had.
Yeah, why the reducing the members to 7 members?
Sure. So the original, Mr. President, Councilor Lewis, the original reasoning behind picking 9 was so that we could make sure it was based off of the fact that with the POB, the Police Oversight Board, when that happened, it was 1 per district. So it kind of just got grandfathered in that we would have 9. The board was saying that, 7 would be something that would be way more manageable for making sure that subcommittees could do their job properly and accurately with the balance, but also so that way, there wasn't a necessary requirement to have 9 kind of based off of an original, I mean, my words are going to be pie in the sky idea that it was based off of the Police Oversight Board. But this was really, we went down to 5, which we found out was too much, too extreme. 9 was okay, but sometimes hard to fill the positions. And we were struggling with that, although I hope to improve that ability. And I think that Mr. Sylvan has done so. And then 7 was what the board was actually requesting. So we were trying to kind of find a way to create balance and compromise with that aspect.
Mr. President, thank you. I think one of the concerns was, well, one of the reasons for this you mentioned was, it sounds like to get a quorum and fill the positions and things like that. I'm just wondering if we're resolving, we're resolving those issues with the other changes, to this bill right here, and if that's sufficient and that we keep the amount of people the same. And I don't know if the board feels really strongly about that, or if that was just one of the many recommendations that they made. I, for one, feel like we need as much representation in there as possible. And it sounds like the participation and the recruiting, if we could solve those issues based on these other solutions that we've got, I think that we get. And I apologize for my video not on, Mr. President. I'm at a once a year work conference. And so my video's not on, but anyways, I wanted to address that. I mean, and if it would cause any heartache to, amend this to just put it back to 9.
I think you had a kind of alluding to the different question, Councilor Lewis, that Councilor Pena raised, which was that, would this be retroactive to any existing members, et cetera? So there's that question as well. That is something that has been from day one of the current system. been something that previous council laid forth and that we've kept as something that we need to strive to do to maintain cultural and racial diversity on the board. So I think that was one point that Councilor Pena made, and fully understand that. We do have a couple other hands raised. I think next in line was Councilor Davis and then Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. No one's made a motion here, and I'm not suggesting we do. I was sort of pressing for this smaller board on behalf of some of the members of the board who brought up that look, there's 9 of us, and sometimes these meetings take 6 hours when everybody wants to talk. Part of it was that it is harder with a larger number of people to be effective in doing your work, and that was one of the criticisms. One of the other criticisms we got was that the way and this kind of gets more to your point, Councilor Lewis, is that sort of the council under the old rules was sort of trying to defer to that diversity by geography piece more than finding the skill sets to deal with the problems at hand. And I really struggled with that because I wanted to be sure we had the right folks from all parts of the city, the right diversity, and we included specific language that ensured that the council and the applicants and the groups that are going through these have to consider those factors that include equity, ethnicity, background, criminal justice experience, which, by the way, it means not just a cop, but someone who's been in the system, who's been an inmate, who's been arrested, anyone who's been in that process. And we thought it was better to focus on those skill sets and tell the council to pay attention to those other things so that we could have more experts who could spend more quality conversations on big issues. And so this really was a way to try to get away from just saying, well, we will kind of, although it didn't really say it, it had 9 members, and that kind of meant 1 from every council district. And we're trying to get away from ensuring that in case we have 2 really great applicants from the same place. And we think this is better. And this came from members of the board who just said 9 members of volunteers is just too unwieldy to manage in a big meeting. And by doing this 7, Mr. President, I was reminded it also meant that their committees could focus more effectively, that they could operate more smoothly, and it was a recommendation from some of those folks. And so I was willing to go along with it. And I think we should be willing to try it. And if it doesn't work, we can add new members.
And just to be clear, we have had a lot of give and take and back and forth with the current board and the acting director. Councilor Bassan, and then back to Councilor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to point out that the number 7 was voted on by the board, and they had emailed over that number by a unanimous vote, I believe. So that's where the number came from. We didn't just put it out there, and it wasn't just kind of a random thing. But we do have the board saying that that's what they wanted. It wasn't just one person or the other that said that. I'm sure I'll have more to answer or ask in just a little bit. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, Councilor Lewis.
Mr. President, was everything that they recommended unanimously voted on? I mean, I guess everything that we're making, every suggestion, every substitution that we're making. So I think that, yeah, I mean, a lot of this was left up to us and to the sponsors to, to make recommendations on. And so this would be one of them. I guess I'm just not generally inclined for less representation on a board like this. And so I'd like to see it, move back to 9. And I know it's not chosen by council districts. So there's still the ability to be able to get some geographical diversity, and just having 2 more members is gonna just allow that geographical diversity as well, or at least more than 7. So, Mr. President, I would like to make a recommendation. I think you all made some great points, but I would like to make a motion to amend this to 9, and just because I think we should weigh in on it. I think we should make it.
Point well taken, Councilor Lewis. We do have a packet of amendments, so okay. We'll definitely put that in the queue. But Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just in reply to that, I think that it's also important that I believe, and I don't know if we haven't confirmed new appointees yet, but I believe we still have 4 vacancies, and the board has unanimously said they want 7. So if we have 4 vacancies, we can keep trying for 9. But this is a way that if we can really try to get good quality board members in here that are diverse, that fulfills an equitable ratio, and that we do our best to really get a whole bunch of balance, I think that it's not really about quantity over quality at that point.
And I'm gonna, did you want to respond, Councilor Lewis?
Yeah, Mr. President, and then, well, I guess when we're doing
Yeah, we
motions,
definitely,
I think that's fine. I'd be glad to move that forward.
we'll have you in the queue for that amendment. Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Mr. President. Was that in the form of a motion? I couldn't hear you was going in and out.
He did move it, Councilor Pena, and you know, we wanted to get to that, but we have a packet of amendments. I don't know, procedurally, maybe I need some help from Mr. Melendres, but is if it's all right with the maker of the motion, I don't know that I saw a second right away. But yeah, it would just go into the number of amendments that we have to consider tonight.
Mr. President, that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. So I just wanted to see if anybody from the board or legal counsel from the CPOA board actually received the amendments that were introduced. I'm not sure whether the board members received it. And so is there anyone here who could answer that question or?
Councilor Bassan.
Mr. President, I don't know which ones actually received it, but I know that we forwarded it to Director McDermott, who then asked permission to forward it to the full board, at which point we granted that, which happened early on Saturday.
And we do have Ms. McDermott here. I'll let her speak at this point with regard to that question. And then I do kind of want to hear her take on where we are currently anyway.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, so the question was, did the board receive this final packet?
Thank you, President and Councilor Pena. Yes, the board was forwarded what I had originally received, which was the draft. I believe it was Friday or Saturday. So they received it, as well as the board's counsel and a member of the Department of Justice. So that was forwarded to them over the weekend. I have not forwarded the most recent because some of those most recent pieces are talked about today, but I have not, but that is different. The over the weekend was sent.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else at this point? Councilor Davis.
Not to berate that point, or to continue that point, Mr. President, but I do want to make clear that the version that was provided to Ms. McDermott and the board members on Saturday and their council had comments from different counselors of proposed amendments. Each of those is included, unless Councilor Bassan can tell me otherwise, the version that we're working on today is just a floor substitute incorporating those amendments along with board comments that we received. I think I saw some as late as yesterday from a board member, Ms. McDermott. So to be clear, if someone thinks they didn't get the latest, they got the version that they saw this weekend that was provided to the board, their counsel, and the DOJ. Is this very version we're working on. It just sort of removed what we recognize as the strike through language and inserted the new substitute amended language. But Mr. President, I think just a point of order, and I apologize, I got distracted when my dogs came to visit. We still have not yet voted on the floor sub, is that right?
That's correct. Did we get a motion and a second on the floor sub? We did have that. So no, we're still on the discussion about substituting the floor sub. Now, again, I think we've had this discussion that if other counselors feel like, you know, they need more time to discuss this, you know, then you know, we don't need necessarily proceed on this tonight. This, as was stated by, I think stated clearly by Mr. Melendres, that this will, I believe, do we have to do a suspension of the rules to do the floor sub again? Did I hear that correctly, Mr. Melendres?
Mr. President and councilors, if you do not move the floor sub, or even floor sub's already been moved, if you withdraw it and don't take a vote on it and you decide to move it next time, then the same rule would apply at that time, which would mean that absent a suspension of the rules, it would need to be deferred once more.
Okay, so, yeah, I would ask counselors to consider this, and then we make amendments to it and either act on it tonight or not. But Counselor Pena, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. President. It was just a clarifying question. So as part of the floor sub, is the 7-member part of the floor sub?
I don't believe it is. It is part of the.
It is. So then my question would go to Counselor Lewis, because it's, so for me, what's a little bit difficult with that is that, I actually, and I really appreciate everybody's, willingness to try to make this work for everyone. I just have always had concern, as Counselor Benton serving as a counselor in my district at one point, it's always very difficult to get people from the district to be able to serve in this capacity. And I think the fact that it is 9 and it is from every single council district, it really just kind of pushes the issue of making sure that we have that diversity and equity as part of this. So for that reason, I just think the 9 is just something that really, keeps us on task with just trying to ensure that there's representation from diverse communities. My fear is that if it goes down to 7, it's not really, that I get the call that we really need to find someone from District 3 to serve on this board. So that is my reservation for, not supporting the 7. So if the floor sub has the 7, I have issue with just voting on the floor sub, so.
Okay, so just to be clear, it's not districted though, right? That the number 9 was a carryover from the old police oversight board. The previous system, that the number was carried over at the time that the new system was put in place in whenever it was 13 or whenever it was, and that number was kept in, but the provision that it's actually districted was not. So anyway, I think understand your point, Councilor Pena. Councilor Bassan, and then Councilor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 things. One, to go back or kind of way back to what Councilor Pena was asking regarding how the changes might affect current board members. I know that Ms. Coulidon, we had originally, once upon a time, what feels like 500 years ago in all the reiterations of this, came up with a clause that essentially did what I'm going to poorly describe as grandfathering. So I know that she was going to look at kind of working an amendment for that to come later. I don't know if you're ready for that yet or not quite, Ms. Coulidon, but I know we're not doing amendments. I just want to make sure that it's, Councilor Pena, that it's in the works. But I believe, and this is where Mr. Melendrez, I'm calling you for Robert's rules, because I believe in our good fancy training, we heard that we can actually do 2 items at once if they're relevant, but does that apply to a floor sub? Because honestly, I'm not going to die on the hill of 9 versus 7. This is not what, I think that there's valid reasons both ways. It isn't based off of per district. It is 9. If we did 9, it's 9 qualified, while trying to strive balance. And I think geography is still part of it. So as long as that's, I'm fine with changing it to 9, but I believe we had learned that, you can have 1 going and then you can do up to 2 things at one time, so that you all would feel comfortable maybe voting for this floor sub tonight if we can chip away at a couple of these details.
Mr. Melendrez on the rules question.
Sure, yeah. In this case, I think you'd actually be doing 3 things at one time technically, but that's actually okay as well. The way that these things work out is if the motions are consistent with one another, that you can stack them up. So the main motion is the bill, secondary motion is the floor sub. And if there are amendments to the floor sub before it's moved, it's similar to a context that we see more often, which is an amendment to the amendment. And so if somebody wants to move that 7 be changed to 9 and that be incorporated into the floor sub, that does get a little bit tricky sometimes, just to make sure that everybody knows what's going on, and especially when it's done orally. And so that's sort of the drawback to that process. In fact, the rules do contemplate that these types of amendments would be done in writing.
So, Mr. President, Mr. Melendrez, how do we do things in writing when we're online? Uh, Can we clarify that? Because I would be willing to second a motion if Counselor Lewis wanted to make the amendment. I think that it's fine, it's appropriate. I don't think, it's something that's super problematic when we're really, I think the changes that we have prescribed in this have been really thought out, with the idea too, if I may, that we recognize this is not the end all be all, this is not the silver bullet, this is not the perfect CPOA ordinance. We're going to have to come back and review it again. We're going to have to see what we're doing right with this change and what maybe we need to fine tune again in the future. But at the same time, I think we're on the right track, and I would hope that we can come to a consensus so that the board knows what to do and how to act from here on out.
Mr. President and Councilor Bassan, it is a relatively simple amendment. And so I think that if that motion has been made to take it back to 9, that's easy enough to incorporate into the substitute that will be prepared after this meeting tonight as the official.
All right. If it's all right with the co-sponsors, I will sort of re-entertain this motion by Councilor Lewis to change this one part of the floor sub. Just to make clear to everyone, however, this has been a very long process, and we want to give a hat off to former Councilor Sena, who was also part of one of the co-sponsors at the inception. It goes back way to last summer, I believe, if I remember correctly. And so there's been a lot of work put in. I'm totally open to amendments on the floor sub, but the floor sub does reflect a lot of give and take with the board and with Ms. McDermott. A lot of their recommendations have been incorporated in this. And just procedurally, it would be nice. I'd be willing to consider this if the co-sponsors are to go ahead and say that we're going to entertain an amendment to the floor sub, which is now, which we really haven't debated any other aspect of yet on this one subject. I did want to perhaps, I'll ask my co-sponsors about that, just since we're here on the fly with this question. Is that all right? I know that Ms. McDermott, I want to ask her a question about it if we're moving forward with this. And is there a second? I believe there was a second from Councilor Pena, correct?
President, on the motion?
Yeah.
Mr. President, if this is appropriate, I'd like to just officially make that motion. And I would have prepared a written statement, a written amendment on it. But again, I felt like it was a pretty, I think as Mr. Melendez said, I think it's just striking a line. It's very straightforward and very simple. And otherwise I would have prepared something and written it, had it ready ahead of time. But two things just very quickly. One is, and I fully understand that this is not, that the 9 members are not geographical. And they weren't previously, and they wouldn't be now if we don't make this change. And so, but it does, again, my point was, it does, I think, allow for a little more diversity there geographically and in other ways. And then also, I fully believe in the other recommendations that have been made in the floor sub. I think these are great solutions, and I support them. And I think if we believe in those solutions, if we believe that those are going to work, then they will also work for the felt need of the reason why we would want to go to seven members. They're going to solve that issue. So that's why I'm making the recommendation. So thank you, Mr. President.
All right. So I see no objections from the co-sponsors. We do have a motion and a second for an amendment to the floor sub, which is on the table now before us as our main motion. And this will be an amendment to that motion of the substitution. And I did want, before we vote on this, my recollection was that there was also a question as part of this lengthy discussion about the number, the sweet spot of the number of members of making a quorum. This is a volunteer board, but I wanted to ask Ms. McDermott and my co-sponsors of their recollection of that discussion.
Sorry, Council President Benton and members. So in terms of the quantity, you're asking if 7 or 9 is considered a better number for quorum purposes. Is that your question? Okay. I just want to make sure I understood. So, either is workable. Of course, when you have more members, then the quorum is easier to attain. But because it is a volunteer board. So the main impact that the quantity has is somewhat quorum, but more importantly, some of the subcommittees and the numbers of people that can be on subcommittees. But 7 and 9, I think, pretty much give you that freedom either way. So I personally don't have a huge, interest in either way. I think either can be beneficial and either can work. So just talking about that aspect of it, I think whichever the council, in my opinion, prefers to go with is workable. So,
And if I may, was that pretty much your recollection of the debate or discussion, if any, amongst the board on 7 or 9?
The board members, so there wasn't a unanimous, I know there's a lot of things that have happened and a lot of things to keep track of. So there were, again, we only have 5 members currently, so it's hard to get a big read on that, I guess. But 3 members did vote in favor of the 7, and 2, I believe, wanted to be the 9. So 4 is to you.
Right. All right, thank you. Any other comments or questions from counselors? If not, we do have this motion on the floor. This would be to change that one provision in the floor sub before we vote on the floor sub. And Ms. Inhofe to call the roll. This would be to change it back to 9, which is where it was when we started.
Counselor Swan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
No.
Counselor Peoplecorn,
No.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
No.
That
Thank you. So we're back on the floor sub as amended. And counselors, as Mr. Melendez explained, in order to move this forward, we could suspend the rules and actually consider the details of this tonight. But at least to put the substitute on the floor is important now procedurally. So at our next meeting, everybody can digest this and we can vote on the bill at that time. In theory, if everyone's amenable, we can vote on the final passage of the bill at that time without a rules amendment at our next meeting. So that's kind of why I think it's at least that it would be worthwhile to get the floor substitute before us so that we can debate and amend that. So unless there's any other questions or statements about that, there's a motion and a second for the substitution. Ms. Inhofe.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Peoplecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
That passes unanimously.
All right, thank you. Now we're back on the bill as substituted. And we do have amendments to the floor subs in the package. And I'm gonna ask Ms. Kuladon to walk us through these, but probably the sponsors probably introduce them first. So I'm gonna start just in this order on top of the packet, right, Ms. Inhofe? This first one would be floor amendment number 1, and this is Counselor Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. President. The CPOA and the APD shall coordinate to develop a mediation program that aims to allow civilian police complaints and officers the opportunity to communicate directly regarding disputes, find areas of agreement, and reach their own solutions. APD should ensure that officers have mentorships, resources available in advance of the mediation to explain the mediation process and the benefits it provides for officers and the relationships with citizens they serve. And the reason for this is I believe that we can eliminate a lot of citizen complaints at a lower level, make sure that these complaints can be taken care of between the officer and the complainant with oversight of a mediator. And that mediator could be part of the CPOA board and also part of APD. So it gets them both involved. And I know there's times when a mediation doesn't want to be accepted by the complainant and maybe just wants the complaint. But I think that if we have skin in the game on both sides, we have the mediator who is actually probably maybe an APD supervisor or a lieutenant, the officer that's involved, and that's the person that was complained on, and then also the complainant in the same room and work out the situation. One, you're going to get the complainant who's going to be okay with, instead of just walking in the door with 2 officers, he's going to see a civilian oversight person in there. And then at that point, he'll be more apt to walk in and resolve that complaint. On the other side, the officer is going to be more apt to want to work that complaint through as well by actually being able to explain what went on. Maybe that officer just saw a severe domestic violence call right before that, and he's a little bit agitated, or just dealt with, just watched a man just smash a lady's face in. And, the next call was the person that complained on him. So there's a lot of things that could be worked out. And I think that if we have both sides with skin in the game, and also the officer working through it, and also hearing an explanation from the officer, and also explanation from the complainant, I honestly believe that you could probably get rid of a ton of very minor complaints. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Counselor. And is there a second on the motion? A second from Counselor Bassan. Thank you. So we are on floor amendment number 1. And I think in the explanation, there was a discussion about how I think this sounds pretty good. Just a caveat, though, is that this would require a waiver from the DOJ to really implement the program once it's worked out. But I think what Councilor Sanchez is proposing here is a process to work it out, and then we'd have to go to that next step for it to be approved by the DOJ. Is that correct? And I guess that's a question for the sponsor of the amendment and perhaps for Ms. Couladon. Councilor Sanchez, or did I get that right? Ms. Couladon?
Mr. President, that is correct. So the city would need to obtain a waiver from the DOJ to continue implementing the mediation program. This is something that has happened in the past. And my understanding is that there is an openness to doing it again, both from the CPOA and the DOJ.
All right, thanks for that explanation. Councilor Bassan.
Mr. President, if we had to get that waiver, what potential, if we were to pass this amendment and eventually in the next couple of weeks pass the floor sub, if we don't get the waiver in advance, how does that fall into this? And I guess there's that part of the question, but also I think this does sound very good. I think that any kind of mediation, and this was part of the discussions that we've been having anyway, as well as in the mediation process, or even in part of the hearing process and public comment, there shouldn't just be one side that gets to speak or that gets assistance. So My second part of the question is this something we should perhaps add in soon, but only after we get a waiver? Which one comes first?
Ms. Couladon, could you address that?
Thank you, Mr. President, Councilor Bassan. So my understanding is that notwithstanding not having a waiver in place currently, as has been the case with this current mediation provision that was contained in the ordinance, it would just be something that's not carried out by the CPOA. And it would be an option should there be a waiver, but it would just be sort of an unenforceable or something that is not acted upon by the board.
Councilor Bassan, any follow-up on that?
Well, I'm not a fan, Mr. President, of doing something that can't be done.
And I see.
So why are we putting it in there per se if we're not going to be able to really follow up on it unless we do the right process to make it effective?
I'm going to ask Ms. McDermott to weigh in. She's got her hand up.
Thank you, Council President and members of the board. So just to kind of answer the one question as Ms. Couladon had said, so in past, the ordinance, of course, did say mediation first. When we did not have the waiver from the DOJ, we just didn't utilize that as an option. So that's how it would continue to work currently. I did want to clarify, however, Councilor Sanchez, if I understood correctly, was the proposal to have the mediators be APD individuals and possibly or CPOA individuals, or did I misunderstand that?
In a perfect world, I'd like to see maybe a police administrator as the one running the meeting. Maybe it could also be maybe the chair of the board. It could, but either way, I think it's important that both get a chance to speak. The person being complained on and the complainant, and at that point, everybody has skin in the game. So one of the things that I thought was very important is that if you have an individual from the CPOA involved in the mediation, then you're also going to get that person who is making the complaint more apt to kind of work it out because somebody from oversight is involved in the room and it's just not two police officers trying to mediate. So if you have the police officer, somebody with authority, and then the person who made the complaint is willing to go ahead and work it out, then I think you can actually get those done pretty quickly. In my past experience at APD, we used to do mediation, and similar to this in terms of going to internal affairs, we would actually ask the person if they wanted to go to mediation and at least have a face-to-face with the officer and try to work out their differences. And if you had a good mediator, and I did some of those mediations myself, you would actually get both sides to communicate with each other and then work it out right there. And by the time they walked out of the room, they shook hands and they were friends. And then the only other problem that I saw is that we would have a low amount of people wanting to walk in the door to the mediation if there was just two officers going to be in the room. They, with a person from the CPOA in there, and it being obvious that they're going to be able to express themselves to somebody who is considered police oversight. And that, my opinion, I think you can actually get probably double, triple, quadruple the amount of people willing to go ahead and follow through with mediation at that point. I don't know if I answered the question.
I did. President Bennett, if you'll indulge me, councilors. So just to kind of, I am familiar with the mediation that you speak of. It was around at the time that I had been employed with the agency when it was the IRO. The way it had worked more currently was that we actually had, we worked through the Alternative Dispute Resolution Department, but we had independent mediators. And I would strongly encourage it to be independent mediators rather than sort of the description that you have right now. We have citizens who are interested in mediation. they generally are reticent to be with officers, but when they find out it is an independent contracted mediator that is not part of the city, not part of APD, not part of us, there is some additional willingness. So I'm very much in favor of a mediation program existing, but I would caution it being kind of in the format that you're describing. I'd probably encourage it to be the independent contracted mediator who is a hired professional for that, to where the citizen and the officer meet with that mediator. And that seems to be the best formula that we've found for most recent versions.
Thank you, Ms. McDermott and Mr. President. One of the things that I've learned as being a police officer for many years is that we have a certain way that we're supposed to be doing things by the book, the SOP, our rules and regulations, the laws govern everything that we do. And what'll happen on your version, it's going to be, what I'm looking at is we're looking at trying to make sure that the citizens understand what the police are doing. That's one of the reasons why we have the police oversight boards here, is that we want to make sure that they understand what's going on in the lives and the world of the police, so they could see what's going on. If you have an independent mediator and don't have an officer or even maybe even a supervisor of the officer, then the fact of what you're supposed to be doing as a police officer can be overlooked or watched by somebody who's in command. I remember as a lieutenant, we'd walk in and the mediation would be ready to start, and you'd see the officer beforehand, and the officer is not going to walk in with an attitude if the lieutenant is sitting there. He's going to do what he has to do to take care of the business, to make sure that he works it out. He's going to learn something from it. It's also going to be a situation where he's going to be probably taught a few things by that lieutenant on how to treat the citizens. If it's an independent mediator, you're going to see probably an officer who walks in and doesn't have a change of his mind or his heart, and doesn't learn something extra that day. And I think it's very important that each and every officer maintains their integrity and walks in and talks and learns something while he's kind of being overseen by one of his superiors, in terms of these policies, these procedures, your attitude, the way you're doing things needs to change. And at that point, that could be carried back to the officer if he's not doing his job and not treating the public in the manner that he should be. So I remember being able to address some of those situations when the officer felt like he was in the right, and an argument just about started to ensue. Then at that point, his higher up can say, wait a minute, and kind of put a stop to that and cool his jets in a way.
We do have some others lined up to speak. I do want to hear from Ms. Kuladon first, and then Councilor Bassan and Councilor Lewis in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to address a couple of things that came up in the discussion between Councilor Sanchez and Director McDermott. First, the ordinance in its current form does state that mediators should be independent of the CPOA, APD, and the city, and should not be former officers or employees of APD. And that's in the existing ordinance before any of these amendments come into play. The amendment proposed by Councilor Sanchez also includes a provision that would ensure that officers have mentorship resources available in advance of mediation. And it doesn't go into detail about what that looks like, but that could certainly be like a supervisor or someone else from APD engaging in some sort of pre-mediation discussion with officers before they get going in that process. Just to
And-
add that.
and is there anything to prevent that type of mentoring prior to the actual mediation?
Councilor Benton, do you mean in the
Well,
CASA or?
Well, the way the CASA, in the CASA or the way this is currently written, that's kind of a pre-preparation with the assistance of seemingly any sort of mentor from APD with the officer who is in question.
Mr. President, no, I don't believe there's anything written that would prevent that from being part of the process for officers engaging in the mediation process.
Thanks for the clarification. Councillor Bassan and then Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Ms. Coulon touched on what I was really hoping to mention as well. So thank you for that. But in addition to that, it's in the amendment that Councillor Sanchez that you have, it reiterates mediators should be independent of the CPOA, APD in the city. So I don't know if you were hoping to strike that or if we're going to leave that, because I again agree. I think that it's good to have both parties have defense or the opportunity for conversation. I would love to have peaceful and less negative outcomes. But at the same time, if we leave it as is, we can't have APD members be the ones to be part of the mediation process. And I just wanted to make sure to clarify that detail before we move on with it.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan and Mr. President. I think it would be an important thing to actually strike, because it, like Ms. Gouldon had advised, if you have that quick meeting before the mediation process, I honestly think that the officer learned something and then goes through the process of mediation. And if it's just a simple situation where he may have cussed or said something that offended them, maybe not directed at them, and they didn't like his attitude or something like that, that could be easily worked out in a quick conference right before that. So I think it probably should be put to work so that we see the whole idea here is that everybody works together. I'd like to see the council come into a nice resolution so that we can actually have everybody that's involved has skin in the game. APD, I think they deserve a chance to actually work it out if it's a minor complaint. I also think that based on the fact that if oversight person was there, then it would actually open up the door for even more mediation and give APD the opportunity to actually correct itself and the officer to learn a valuable lesson. And that's where I was getting at in reference to this.
Mr. President, if I may respond to that.
Yes, Councilor
Thank
Bassan.
you. So Councilor Sanchez, it sounds to me like, I'm all for the mentoring part of it. I don't think it's wise to strike out the line mediators should be independent of the CPOA, APD, and the city, because to me, a mediator needs to be a completely and entirely neutral party in order to sit there with both parties involved and be able to discuss the avenues and the aspects of what they're about to try to figure out as far as details. So I think the mentorship is a great idea. The mentorship, make sure that the officers and whomever needs mentoring for that matter on one side or the other. To me, that's I can totally agree to that. I don't know if I would support, or I wonder too, and if the DOJ would support any kind of waiver or anything if we said that mediators are not independent. So I just want to clarify. I think it sounds to me like you're really talking about more the mentorship, not necessarily the mediator.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan, Mr. President. I actually understand exactly what you're saying, and it does make sense. The way you're putting it in is if we have that mentorship right before the mediation, I think that it would actually work out with the same way that I'm talking about. So I think that would work. Thank you so much. I think that's really, really good. And thanks for clarifying that. I like it.
And Councilor Lewis is in the queue, but just to clarify, would that mean that I mean, the mediation program, I think is anticipated as the city's alternative dispute resolution program. So would that obviate the need for the first sentence of your change and then just keep the second? Is that correct? Is that acceptable, Councilor Sanchez?
Yes, I actually like what Councilor Bassan says. If we could still have some sort of process where the officer can maybe meet with maybe one of his supervisors and get a little bit of training right before the mediation, and then get a little bit of training right after that mediation, and then the rest of the process would be as I explained, including a oversight member. That does sound like it'll work fine. Thank you.
All right, Councilor Lewis.
Yeah, Mr. President, I just before I was going to comment, I think I saw that Mr. Melendez might want to clarify what you were just talking about, but I do think this is how good amendments are made, and so this will get ironed out. And I also understand that there have been that city legal has requested waivers similar to this, and that the DOJ has concurred. And so I think if we just get the right language on this, that we'll get this. But really, doing this amendment is kind of our charge to the city legal to make that request, to send that waiver. And I don't see it. I see them concurring on it as well. But it sounds like we just need to work out a little bit of the language here. And I saw that Chris might want to comment on that as far as getting that language right.
Mr. President, and thanks, Councilor Lewis. I just want to clarify, because there's been a lot of discussion over this amendment, but I think after hearing from Councilor Sanchez and Councilor Bassan and sort of that reconciliation of ideas, that my understanding is that the amendment is fine as written. I think there was a question initially that it might need some changes. And I don't believe that Ms. McDermott's shop, the CPOA, historically has used the same city mediators. I think she referenced that they've hired their own independent mediators for this purpose. And so I think that the intent of the amendment is that just some amount of coordination happen between APD and CPOA so that that pre-mediation mentorship can occur. So it seems like the meeting of the minds is that the language is okay on the amendment as it is.
Okay, is that correct, Councilor Bassan, as far as your discussion on that?
Yes, Mr. President, I think that, I mean, I just wanted to make sure that once we clarified the difference between mediator and mentor, I think that really helped. Thank you.
Right, and I think this is outlining, just saying that APD and CPOA should collaborate on deciding the program. When it's time to actually call for mediation, that's still at the discretion of the director. I believe, but let's hear from Ms. McDermott from her perspective. You're muted.
Just a few points of clarification. So yes, absolutely collaboration between the department and the CPOA. We have encouraged educating the department generally about mediation, the benefits, the challenges, things like that. So I just wanted to throw that out there. To clarify the mechanism, so in the past, we have used city contracted mediators through the ADR agency. However, we actually do want to have a direct contract, assuming that the budget cycle here is approved. We want to hire contracted mediators directly, so that we have a direct conduit versus a go-between. So I just did want to clarify that. Yes, we've used ADR in the past. Our plan to make this more successful would be to have a direct connection with it. And I forgot whose question about what the DOJ would be in support of. When it comes to it, based on conversations I've had, not to speak for them, but based on conversations I've had, it would need to be independent mediators for them to sort of grant that waiver. So pre-mentorship and programs and education, perfectly great, but actual mediators would have to be independent. So thanks for the indulgence.
I see Mr. Morrow from the Office of City Attorney is turn his camera on. Do you have something to comment on, Mr. Morrow?
I do. Thank you, Council President. And I just wanted to address Councilor Lewis and his request that the City Attorney's Office reach out to the Department of Justice. I have been in continuous contact with Ms. Martinez and other members of the DOJ team, and I think they are willing to entertain another temporary modification, aka kind of a pilot program to address this mediation process. I also echo what Ms. McDermott said, that they would likely insist on an independent mediator process, but I'm happy to reach out to DOJ and also to get back with the counselors to let you all know what that looks like and what the timelines will end up being.
So I think that's, thank you, Mr. Moore, for that clarification and your willingness to take this on. Yeah, I think, so I may have taken us down a rabbit hole talking about ADR program. So thanks for that correction, Ms. McDermott. And I believe, so my sense at this point is this amendment is still before us as presented, as written, and that we don't see a conflict here based on what Mr. Melendres said. Unless there's any further discussion, we'll go to a vote on amendment number 1. Ms. Hinojos.
Council Basan.
Ms. Hinojos, may I please clarify, is this amendment number 2 though?
It is actually amendment number 2.
Does it matter? This is the one that,
Well, Mr. President, we already voted on amendment number 1, which was Councilor Lewis's changing of the 9 members to the 7 members to 9 members. So I just wanted to make sure that this was
is that correct?
Number 2.
Okay, thank you. So this is amendment number 2.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Stand corrected. Thank you, Ms. Hinojos.
Council Basan.
Yes.
Council Davis.
Yes.
Council Peoplecorn.
Yes.
Council Grout.
Yes.
Council Jones.
Yes.
Council Lewis.
Yes.
Council Pena.
Yes.
Council Sanchez.
Yes.
Council Benton.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
All right, thank you, Ms. Hinojos. Now we're on floor amendment number 3. And I did misspeak. These are the only, this is the last amendment that we have, correct, Ms. Hinojos, for tonight. So again, Councilor Sanchez, floor amendment number 3.
Thank you, Mr. President. Board members also participate in at least 2 police ride-alongs for every 6 months of service on the board, with at least 1 ride-along to be completed each quarter. I know that this ups the amount of ride-alongs, but in my opinion, we want to get to collaborate with both the police oversight and also with the police department. And I think it's very important that that the officers and the oversight members try to find a way to work together and be more active with each other. You can end up being an oversight member and developing a relationship with the officer and actually just see what actually goes on a day-to-day. I think it's really important that if you do a ride-along, you do a ride-along on a Friday night so that you can see what goes on within a very, very busy shift. So I think it's really important to see what the officers go through and how it is taxing on an officer to go from call to call to call to call to call and not have a whole lot of break in between, and also see what they actually deal with in these days, in this day and age. So I think it's really important that actually we actually increase the ride-alongs. Thank you.
And did you make a motion for approval, Councilor?
Yes.
Okay, and is that a second, Councilor Basan?
I'll second it, Mr. President, but I also have a question.
Okay, proceed with your question.
Thank you, sir, Mr. President. Councilor Sanchez, I'm wondering, so in there, it actually says that it's 2 police ride-alongs every 6 months. So I'm wondering, I mean, 1 per quarter, 2 6 months. I don't see it as being upped so much as just making sure that the frequency is spread out over 3 months and 3 months. Can you just clarify can you clarify that and the intention, and really, is it splitting hairs? Which one's more important?
I think, thank you, Councilor Hassan and Mr. President. I think it's important to actually be in a situation where you actually spread it out. 4 ride-alongs in a year would actually be a better opportunity. And you're right, it's not moving them up. I just think that one should be added every quarter, so that way it's separate and keeps the flow going, instead of cranking 2 ride-alongs early on and then 2 ride-alongs at the very end. If you can keep one going every quarter, then at that point you're actually doing the 4 ride-alongs, and you break it up. But not only do you break it up, but you have more frequency in a way.
Mr. President.
Please.
Thank you. Councilor Sanchez, I'm wondering, I mean, I'm fine with that. I mean, again, to me, I can see both sides of that, and how, to me, it's fine. But my question too to you is, what do you think about, it sounds to me like when you're talking about this, you're really talking, there's an importance of making sure that the ride-alongs are not necessarily all 4 at the same time each time, and the same shift. And I'm wondering if perhaps that's something that you might want to entertain or think about, as far as adding in, making sure that one's from a different shift each time, so that you have graveyard, swing, morning, to make sure that there's that balance too, or maybe not.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan, Mr. President.
Yes.
The thing that I'd like to see the most, and this is just me speaking based on the fact that I've worked out there, is if we can even, and I don't know, this might be stretching it, but if you set up the ride-alongs on a Friday or Saturday night, then you get the full feel of what it's like to be a police officer. So I agree with you. If we could even add something like that in, and that would be, I'd like to hear what Ms. McDermott says in reference to that. It would be nice to actually have each one of the board members get the full feel of what it's like to be a police officer during a extremely busy Friday or Saturday night. That would be really getting to know what police go through. So if I could do something like that, that'd be great. But I'd like to hear Ms. McDermott's input.
I'm going to thank you, Councilor Sanchez. I'm going to recognize Councilor Davis, who had his hand up, and then we can go to Ms. McDermott.
I'll go to Ms. McDermott. I just want to say, I hear what you're saying, Louis, Councilor Sanchez. I appreciate it, and I don't disagree. I think I also just want to I think we ought to just think about, this is very important, I think, maybe for new folks in particular, but these are also volunteers, and they're already working, near as we can tell from some of the times that the board members have shared, 60, 70, 80 hours. I think one person said they did 100 hours one month just to keep up with the subcommittees and whatnot. And we're also requiring them to do training, which is mostly nights and weekends to accommodate everybody else. And so this is a pretty intensive board. I absolutely would. They should have ride-along requirements. It's why it's in the CASA. But doing this quite this frequently does, I think it's going to become a deterrent. And we had 9 members, and I think we have, what I think Ms. McDermott told us, 5 now. We've really had a hard time with getting people who had the ability to flex that time out. And so I just worry that it might be a deterrent to add this extra requirement at this point. And so I'm interested in hearing more, but I think the more prescriptive we get about this, the harder it will be to find the right folks.
All right, we'll hear from Ms. McDermott and then Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Councilor President and members. So yes, I would certainly encourage diversity of going different shifts, different locations, different times. So I think that's something that probably should be encouraged and decided amongst the membership, though, as opposed to prescribed in ordinance, because there are many challenges for various volunteers, being that, if they work a night shift, as an example, they wouldn't be able to go on a night ride along or day shift or whatever. So there might be limitations that I don't know that you'd want to be, as Councilor Davis had put, as restrictive in ordinance, but certainly it can be encouraged in the rules that the board drafts to encourage diversity of shifts, encourage diversity of locations, but not necessarily require it. When it comes to the actual numbers, again, I don't know that it matters 2 every 6 months versus 1 a quarter. I'm not sure that that distinction probably affects anybody too dramatically, but certainly requiring certain times of days or places or things that could be problematic.
Thank you. Councilor Pena and then Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President, and not just related to this amendment, but it's my understanding that Chair Galloway is here, and I kind of regret that we hadn't asked her to kind of be available to speak on some of these amendments or get her suggestions as well. I know that she's probably, I think she's been on the board since almost the inception. So if Ms. Galloway is available, I'd love to ask her input on this amendment and, you know, just an overall opinion of what we're doing here tonight.
We'll allow that. So Ms. Galloway, if you're ready to speak, please proceed.
Hi, President Benton. Thank you so much, Councilor Pena. I appreciate your acknowledging that some of this may affect the board directly and giving us a voice. So thank you so much for that. I would echo what Ms. McDermott said as regards to this particular floor amendment or substitution, that requiring board members that already are volunteering their time to the extent that we do, and particularly with the few numbers that we have, and in consideration of reducing what should be a 9-member board to 7 members, I think making that a requirement is probably ill-advised. I think that the board can decide for ourselves whether or not that should be required by us. And if we think that it should be required by us, we can require it in our policies and procedures. And it's much easier for us to amend those policies and procedures, you know, within a month's notice than getting an ordinance amendment passed, as we've all seen. We've been at this for, you know, what, 6 months now. So I would strongly recommend not making that an ordinance requirement, but I will be happy to take it back to the board because I'm in full agreement with you that when I stagger my shifts, my ride-along shifts, it's a very different perspective. I also agree that, and I'm not sure if you've said this, but changing the area command that you are participating in a ride-along in makes a big difference. The Northwest is very, very different from the Valley and from the Heights. So all of those things are things that we can handle in our policies and procedures. We can encourage from our board members, or we can require from our board members, dependent on what the board thinks. And so that's how I feel about that one.
Thank you, Ms. Galloway. Councilor Bassan, you're next. And
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to follow up with Chair Galloway too, and Director McDermott as well on that. So thank you both. I don't want to limit the board anymore. As a matter of fact, I thought I was about to save Albuquerque for the record, and then I found out I wasn't. So I'm sorry about that, Albuquerque. But at the same time, I don't think it really makes a difference, it sounds like, for the once every 3 months, twice every 6 months. But we could add in, and this is where my question to both of you is, if we were to just add in something that is not too prescriptive, but yet also for the sake of Councilor Sanchez, maybe if you're amenable to it, something to the effect of board members are encouraged to complete ride-alongs on different shifts and in different area commands when possible. So that really it's just saying, well, this is in the ordinance that we are also encouraging it, but I absolutely think that part of this job description, we've actually added that into this floor sub, is saying that there should be a job description that's created, and that we should get some more details on that. Not the council doing it, but that the board and the director work on that. So I think that would make sense to put it in that as a policy versus necessarily, making sure that we put it in here. However, for the sake of compromise, maybe we can add something in there that's a recommendation versus a requirement.
all right, we have the sponsor of the amendment, Councilor Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Councilor Bassan. Thank you, Ms. Galloway. I really appreciate it. I don't have a problem. What I was looking forward to is to actually have a little bit more exposure for them, because I think it's really important that they do. But if you can include that in policy, I don't have a problem withdrawing this at all, this amendment, not at all. I like the discussion and I respect what the board says and my fellow counselors, and it makes sense. So no problem.
Mr. President and Councilor Sanchez, I can't promise you it'll end up in policy and procedure because there are other members of the board. I don't act unilaterally, but we can certainly take it back and discuss that. I would appreciate that. And I think just very quickly, if I can, just make the request of council that anytime communication is sent, it should include our legal counsel, our chair of the board, and our agency staff, and not any one or the other unless it's privileged and only for those things. I think we were caught just a little bit off guard and would appreciate, that consideration.
All right, thank you, Ms. Galloway. Councilor Bassan.
Mr. President, this is, if I may propose an amendment to the amendment. I would, is that okay, Mr. President?
I'm sorry, I just had to speak to staff for a moment. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I
Please
was
repeat.
hoping to propose an amendment to the amendment, adding in board members are encouraged to complete ride-alongs on different shifts and in various area commands when possible.
All right, well, Councilor Sanchez just indicated willingness to withdraw the amendment, so I'll defer to him. That wasn't, I don't think, were you the second on the amendment? I can't remember who it was now. So that would be up to you but up to you and the maker of the motion.
Okay, Mr. President, Councilor Sanchez, I guess to me, if it's important to make sure that it gets in policies, then it does need to be put in the ordinance as a request, not necessarily a requirement or a recommendation rather than a requirement. But if you feel that this has been satisfied by the promise made of the intention to try to get the board to approve it, then I think that if you still want to withdraw it, then I will support that.
Councilor Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Councilor Bassan. I have no problem. So basically what I'm looking at is if does it stay the same? Participate in at least 2 ride-alongs for every 6 months of service on the board. And then my amendment was with at least 1 ride-along to be completed every quarter. So if I withdraw the amendment, it's going to be withdrawing with at least 1 ride-along to be completed each quarter. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm okay with withdrawing that amendment.
All right, if you're okay with withdrawing that amendment, Councilor Bassan?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, so floor amendment number 3 has been withdrawn, which takes us back to the bill as amended. I will ask my co-sponsors to weigh in on this, but I would be inclined to go ahead and defer this to our next meeting so everybody can have a chance to digest it one more time and that we act upon it in the next meeting.
Mr. President, I am okay with that, but I do have one more amendment that we had sort of began to discuss at the beginning of all of this, and I wanted to make sure to circle back.
All right.
If I may.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to move.
This will still be floor amendment number 3, won't it? Or no, this was 4 because even though the other one was drawn. Okay, so this would actually be 4.
Okay, so I would like to move floor amendment number 4, where on page 10, line 22, we would insert, this provision shall apply only to board members who are appointed after the effective date of Council Bill number 02178. That way, we hopefully will be able to relieve some of the concern about existing board members and or their applicability of getting kicked off of the board should we end up passing this without taking that into consideration.
Very good. Is there a second? I see a second from Councilor Pena. Thank you for bringing this up, Councilor Pena, and Councilor Bassan for considering that concern. So we do have a motion and a second. Any discussion on this provision? Including from our Ms. Colodon, and I don't know that there's any issue with this, but anyone here to comment further on this amendment? All right, if not, then we'll go to a vote.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pivocorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis,
I think Councilor Lewis, I did see a note from him and he is not excused.
okay, thank you. Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
That passes unanimously with Counselor Lewis excused.
Thank you. Well, we're back on the bill as amended. And I will move a deferral until March 7th, where hopefully we'll have final action. Is there a second? Second from Councilor Bassan. Thank you, Councilor. Any further discussion? We do respect the desire of everyone, including Ms. McDermott and the board members and the general public, to look at this as it's now constituted, and that we're able to respond to any remaining questions on the 7th. I know that there was an appeal made earlier by Mr. Lippman, who was commenting in the public comment that we should stop the train, but this train has been moving for a long time. And we're very, I'll speak for myself that I'm hopeful about the folks that I've interviewed that may be coming onto the board. And I appreciate the interactions with the present board and Ms. McDermott. Very helpful. It has been a collaborative process, but give it another couple of weeks here, and that's my intention. So thank you for that second. And we are now back on the motion for a deferral until our next meeting. Ms. Hinojos.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Pivocorn,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
Counselor Lewis is excused. Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
That passes unanimously. It is postponed as substituted and amended.
Thank you. So we'll look forward to further comment and discussion between now and then. And councilors, there being no further business, this city council meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Buenas noches.